Bulldogs. My name is Caden Trong, here with the WBR MHS TV, and today we have Mr. Panwan amongst their very, very long theatric schedule. Mr. Panwan?
Hi, Caden.
To start off the interview, we would like to ask what led you to enlist into the U.S. Navy in the first place?
Okay, well, to be honest, it's something that I wasn't ever planning to do. I was 31 years old when I went in, and the reason that I went into the military was because of the security that it was going to give my family. You know, I was working a job at the time that was working only on commission, and I just wanted a little bit more security in the job that I was going to have, and my manager at the time suggested the military. Once again, I was 31 years old. And I looked into it, and I went into the military. I mean, I went into the enlisted side. I wanted to go into it as an officer. I had a theater degree, and at that time, I had my master's. And at that time, I wasn't sure if that was going to be the kind of degree that was going to allow me to go into the officers program right away. But that's basically why I went into the military enlisted, because I was told at that time by my manager at my job that it would be the easiest way to get in and offer that security with my family.
What could you tell us about first being deployment, the location, the time, and your general feelings during it?
Well, the first deployment, really hit me when I was in boot camp. I was in boot camp and I was getting my wisdom teeth pulled. Walking back to the barracks after surgery, as I walked in, the TV was on. Everyone was huddled around the TV. And that was when 9/11 happened. And I remember our platoon sergeant saying, well, everyone get ready, because we're going to war. At the time, I was kind of just still recovering from surgery. I was able to walk back to the barracks, but I was just still I wasn't sure if I was dreaming what was happening. It literally took about a year of training, because I was in boot camp. After about a year is when I actually was going on my first deployment. The unit that I was attached to were the tanks. It was a battalion tank unit out of Camp Lejeune. And that's what led to my first deployment, really. So that was a pretty big moment, because up to that point, you just never know when you're going to go to war, right? It may never happen. But that's what you're training to do, right? You're serving your country, and you're training to be able to support your country in whatever your job is. I was a medic in the military, and like I said, I was attached to a tank battalion. As a medic in the Navy supports the Marines. See, the Marines don't have their own medics. They depend on the Navy for medical support. The Army has their own medics, the Air Force has their own medics, but the Marines, they depend on Navy personnel when it comes to medical treatment.
You also mentioned a second deployment.
That is true. My first deployment was with the tank battalion back in 2003. Returning from that deployment, we had a little bit of a break, a few months, but because the deployment was at the end of my, the first deployment was at the end of my contract, and I had to renew my contract. I negotiated for my family to go to Rhode Island on my second duty station. We got there around 2005, right, to that duty station. So we get to Rhode Island, and I'm there, and within the first 6 months, right, because we're still at war at this time, within the first 6 months, the clinic was already calling for a deployment. I knew I was attached, but the clinic was already calling for a deployment. I was like, I know I'm just getting here, but I'm either gonna stay here and be told what to do, be caught off guard and say, hey, you're leaving tomorrow, right, which could happen, or I was going to volunteer again for my second deployment and have control over when I was going to go. And I think the more I thought about it, I think I wanted that control. So when they called for volunteers, I said, you know what? Oh, I'll go, right? And I think that kind of felt better for me to have control of when I was going to go and potentially when I was going to come back. Within 3 or 4 months, I was already off to my second deployment. By choice. I look back on that. The reason I did it was because I wanted to have control of when I was going to deploy as opposed to them telling me, you're going. But what's interesting about my second deployment is that I was attached to an infantry unit. This time it wasn't a tank battalion, which was a totally different experience.
Right, because with the tanks you would be on wheels, but with the infantry you would be on foot.
Absolutely. With tanks, obviously, you know, as a medic, I rode in I think it was called an M88. It was a tank that was like a tow truck. If you think of a tow truck, tanks actually have tow trucks, right? Or they have tow tanks, right? These huge, enormous tanks that if a tank breaks down, they rely on this M88 to go and tow the tank away, because you just never want to leave a tank just lying around, right, for people to kind of come look at or investigate or take parts from. So the medics rode in those tow-like tanks, which are like huge. And that was the first deployment. The second one, on foot, in a Humvee, some of the time, but a lot of times on foot. So.
On to our next question. What aspect of the military life did you find to be the most difficult to manage?
I think for me, I think being separated from my family was difficult, just because during that time I had 2 boys, and my third one was actually born when I got back to my first deployment. So I had 3 little boys, right? And so on my second deployment, you know, they were still just little babies. The youngest one was like maybe 3 or 4, but they were still little kids, you know. I mean, 3 or 4, they were 3 years apart. Then I had like maybe a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. And, you know, my role as a dad, leaving them, was tough. And knowing that with every deployment, there's no guarantee that I'm gonna come back. We went off and we trained in California for like months. And then we came back home for vacation, right, to see our families before we actually left to go to Iraq. And I remember in that in-between, seeing my kids, and I'm not sure how much they understood. I guess they understood that I was in the military, but I don't know if they fully understood where I was going or what I was doing. And I remember having to tell them goodbye. That was kind of tough. I remember my oldest at the time, he was like 9, 10. He had a cold, he was sick, and he didn't feel good. And it was tough being separated from my family, so that was one challenge.